According to the English Standard Version commentary, that's in this big Bible. I don't carry it around just for my biceps, but it helps. According to that ESV commentary, Luke's broader audience, his intended audience, consisted primarily of Gentile Christians, like a man named Theophilus, who had already been taught about Jesus. And what this means for us is that Luke's gospel is for us. For we most certainly have been taught, have heard about Jesus, and have been taught about Jesus. And we too are goyim. That's the Hebrew word for non-Jews, that we translate Gentiles. And we haven't grown up in the traditions and the culture of Jewish society. So keep that in mind as we listen to this scripture reading and deal with this story today. You probably heard this from Mandy. I should call her Pastor Amanda, shouldn't I? She was always Mandy to us. But no gospel encompasses such a complete range of subgenres as Luke, writes the ESV commentary. Annunciation stories, birth narratives, lyric praise psalms, Christmas carols, prophecies, genealogies, preparation stories, temptation stories, calling stories, recognition stories, conflict stories, encounter stories, miracle stories, pronouncement stories, parables, beatitudes, sermons, proverbs, passion accounts, trial narratives, and resurrection accounts. Wow. Our passage today falls into one of these genres of literature that answers the question, who is this Jesus? Now this section begins in chapter 7 and starts with the phrase, after he had finished all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. This is how Luke introduces the next section of his gospel. And basically, Luke is saying, after he finished his sayings in the hearing of the people, Jesus went home. That's right. Most scholars believe that Capernaum was where Jesus lived during his ministry. He probably lived with Peter, but Capernaum was Jesus' home base for ministry. So Luke, attempting to answer the question, who is this Jesus, for goyim like us, begins with, Jesus came home. Though Jesus obviously had a greater mission, he also had a home. One might recall the words of John's gospel. He came to his own, and his own received him not. But as many as did receive him, to them he gave the right to become children of God. But they did receive Jesus in Capernaum. He was a regular fixture there. Now Nain, it's kind of a funny name for a town, isn't it? Nain was about a 2 or 3 hour walk from Capernaum. It was located in southern part of the region of Galilee. So just for comparison, that would be like walking to St. Louis from here. Imagine doing that. Then imagine a great crowd is following, approximately half the population of Wakaw. Now the town of Nain had a gate. Here in Saskatchewan, I can only think of maybe forts having a gate. Do you know of any town with a gate? So towns with gates had walls, and those walls protected them during the night from marauding bands of thieves. If a town had a gate, it was likely a walled city, like the gates of Jerusalem. So while the walls kept the thieves out, the walls also provided a religious boundary. If you had been raised Jewish, you would know the laws. And one such law made it clear that the dead were always buried outside the camp, outside the city. So Jesus was visiting Nain, when at the precise point of entry, his band of disciples and the crowd following him encountered this small crowd of people bringing their dead loved one outside the city for burial. Luke must have heard the details of this story, and he recounts the circumstances of this situation. The dead loved one was a man, the only son of his widowed mother. Now, this is very significant. The son would have been her caretaker and provider. He was her sole means of support. So this widow was not only about to bury her only son, she was burying all hopes, future hopes of independence. She would now be totally dependent on her neighbors and friends, for there were no family left to provide the obligatory care and support for her. The fact that there was a considerable crowd from the town indicates that she was loved and respected in the community, that her grief was theirs by connection. I'd say this was a fairly tight community, and they were grieving the loss of a member of their community who had faithfully discharged his duty to care for his widowed mother. Now, do you think that maybe you guys could relate to a similar situation where a well-respected member of the community died, or even a member of the congregation, like Dr. Zinenko? I suppose we can identify quite well with the feelings of grief that would accompany such a loss. You know, as you think about it, it's nearly impossible to avoid loss these days. And I think it was likely that way in this town of Nain long ago. So it would not, therefore, be such a stretch for us to imagine this scene that Luke portrays for us in telling this story. The funeral procession is coming out as Jesus and his disciples are going in, and they collide. Jesus, seeing the widow's great loss and her tears, stops and he says, "Do not weep." That seems like a strange thing to say. Don't cry. I'm going to pause for just a moment here, and I'm going to say that this is not something we understand out of context. When I was a boy, and maybe when you were, some of you older men were boys, my father used to say, "Stop crying, or I'll give you something to cry for." And he meant it. I may have been afraid of something, but I was more afraid of my father, so I held my tears. Probably not the best idea from a mental health perspective. Anyway, this passage is not meant to be the justification for telling someone to shut up and stop crying. As Dr. Lloyd John Ogilvie used to say, impression without expression leads to depression. Impression without expression leads to depression. So it is important to cry. But Jesus tells this widow to stop weeping. Now, he isn't telling us that there's no place for crying, but Jesus is about to do something extraordinary, and he wants her to see it. She won't see what he is about to do if her eyes are filled with tears. For something she never expected was about to happen. Jesus was about to take away her reason for crying. The next thing Jesus does is quite out of the question for a Jewish rabbi. Jesus touches the death bier that's bearing this dead body. One of the quickest ways to become unclean in the Jewish laws was to touch anything connected to death. But Jesus touches the bier. Jesus, the definition of perfection, the model of holiness, touches the bier, and everyone stops. Who is this guy? Can you imagine it? I bet you could have heard a pin drop in the dust. Jesus says to the dead man. Yes, Jesus speaks to the dead man as if he can hear. Think about that for a moment. Not even death is a barrier for Jesus. He says to the dead son of the weeping widow, "Young man, I say to you, arise." And he does. He sits right up and he begins to talk. He must have been an extrovert like me. Unfortunately, Luke never tells us what the young man says, but we can imagine. Wasn't I sick? The last thing I remember is Mom leaning over me and weeping, and this crowd pressing in all around, and they were crying, and then all was black. Well, what are you doing? Why are you carrying me out? Well, we don't really know what he said. But the point is that everyone saw what Jesus did, and they were scared to death. They were seized with fear. No one had ever seen someone raise a dead man before. But look at their response according to Luke. They glorified God, and they said, "A great prophet is here among us. God has visited his people." And of course, the news spread. To tell you the truth, I cannot imagine what this event must have been like for that widow, her son, the town of Nain. But I bet it had far-reaching ramifications. Sure, Jesus was to raise Lazarus from the dead after 4 days in a grave, but this was just before the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. For this place in this time, I know what the answer to our question would have been. Who is this Jesus? He is the one for whom not even death can refuse. He is the life giver, the giver of hope, the restorer, the most compassionate man this widow had likely known. You know, I know little of what's going on in your lives today. Maybe you're grieving. Maybe you lost someone recently. Perhaps your marriage needs some work and you're stuck, wondering where is Jesus in all of this. Many today haven't a clue who Jesus is. They've heard about him. They may even know someone who claims to follow him. But who is this Jesus? Where is this Jesus? Have you ever asked yourself, is he going to come to Wakaw? You may think I'm being funny, but I'm not. Would Jesus come to Wakaw? Would Jesus come and show compassion for your grief? Would Jesus come and touch your death, your loss, your struggle? Would Jesus come and respond to your tears? Yes. 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 Jesus would come to Wakaw. And he wants to come. And he wants to touch us. But will we let him? Will we be terrified? Would we shout, God has visited his people in Wakaw? Would you spread the good news? We're living in scary times. But Jesus is still alive and well, and he speaks to the dead as if they can hear, because they can. Jesus has overcome death, and in him we have life, and not just a dull life. In him there is victorious life abundant. You may remember this word from the last sermon I preached here. Evangelion. 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 We've won. I know most of you here have already answered the call from Jesus, perhaps a lifetime ago. But have you heard from him lately? Is it time for a reunion? Is it time to ask him to come again and touch you? He does come. He comes to us anew, and we embrace his presence. In fact, now we are about to symbolically eat his presence. This here is the table of Jesus. And he invites all who would come. Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. So come to this table not because you must, but because you may. And come not because you have no sin, but because all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and here you will find forgiveness and cleansing for your souls. Come, let us answer Jesus' invitation.